very pleased to welcome back here to Montana Talks former Montana Congressman Denny Rehberg joining us here this morning on the show. First off, Denny, great to hear from you, and I hope you and your family are doing well. It looks like you've been getting in some good grandpa time with some of the quarantines.
Yes, we have a 6-month-old, and we just love him to death. Our first grandbaby. It took 64 years to get there, but we're thrilled to death and spending a lot of quality baby time.
It's great. I know I've seen some of the pictures that your daughter Katie has shared, and just a beautiful family all around, beautiful baby. So that's been cool. You know, if you got to be quarantined, I couldn't think of a better situation to be stuck in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't hurt to be on a ranch either.
That's true.
We're always quarantined.
Yeah, that's right. I heard from Alan Redfield in Paradise Valley when this all started up, and he said quarantine. He said we call that calving season.
That's right. That's exactly right. If you get hungry, we have deer and antelope and turkeys floating around. Hopefully we don't get to the point where we have a meat shortage, but we certainly have it out here. That's one of the things I remember about the Depression. My in-laws had the farm down on King and Shiloh, and they said that during the Depression, relatives came from all over the country, and they did the Rehberg Ranch as well, and they moved in. And we're happy to have family on the ranch with us.
Yeah. Well, speaking of grandbabies, that was one thing I think I'll remember most about former Montana Congressman Ron Marlenee is he really loved his grandbabies. I last saw him at a wedding for one of his grandbabies, and boy, he just had a smile on his face the entire time. It was like a smile that just wouldn't disappear, but many folks probably haven't heard the news yet. I know it has been mentioned publicly on social media and elsewhere, but there haven't been any news stories yet or anything. But we did get the sad news that former Montana Congressman Ron Marlenee passed away over the weekend, and I know you had heard the news as well, but you got to know Ron pretty well over the years.
Yeah, I in fact called him last May 9th. 2019, because it was the 40th anniversary of when he first hired me. Right out of college, Jan wanted to go to law school, and I couldn't really see myself ranching in Missoula, and so I called up Ron Marlenee and said, "Are you interested in having a staffer come to Washington, D.C.?" And he said, "Be on a plane tomorrow." And so I was on the plane the next day, and I was on his permanent staff from 1979 to 1982.
Oh, wow. So a few years there, yeah, and I've gotten to run into a couple of different friends over the years that worked for Ron. Obviously, I didn't really start playing around in the political scene until really the late '90s, early 2000s. Of course, when you were serving as Montana Congressman. So kind of talk more about Ron Marlenee's kind of legacy as a member of Congress from Montana, and just what he was like as a person to work for.
Well, at that time, Ron was the only opportunity for young Republicans to work in that political arena because Montana was pretty well controlled by the Democrats, and he was serving in a minority in Washington, D.C., and so it was difficult for him because, he wanted to be a leader, and being in the minority was tough on him. But I ended up on the same committees that he was on. Because there are two important committees to Montana, and that's agriculture and natural resources. And I'll tell you what, if you didn't know the price of wheat when you walked in every single day to that office, you got chewed out because he cared about Montana agriculture enough to know what the current state of events was. And keep in mind, back then, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have computers. We had typewriters, and we were lucky to maybe get a typewriter with a correcto button. But he was a perfectionist. He never wanted a letter to go out that had whiteout. He never wanted a letter to go out that looked like it had been corrected. And so every letter that went out from the congressional office to a constituent that had written in or had an interest had to be perfect. It had to be his philosophy, trying to explain to the best of his ability. There were certain things he didn't like. He didn't like us to use the words folks. Because he said, you make Montana sound like a bunch of country bumpkins, and we're not. We're smart people, and we're good business people, and we're as good as everyone else in the country. And so he was a stickler for things like that, and that's what I respected most, was the fact that he took his job very seriously. Some people didn't get to see the fun and human side of him with his grandbabies and his staff and his friends, because He had a gruff exterior, but he had a big heart.
Well, that's why, you think of it, that's part of one of the things that I know folks really like about him is that I was seeing some old pictures that I think Betty Hill had shared, and he kind of had that smirk on his face and kind of the mischievous smirk on his face. But folks who've gotten to know him more probably recently in Bozeman got to know the lighter side of him. But that seriousness, I think, is important. You make a good point that he's being demanding, not just because he's being demanding. It's because of a respect for the office that he held to serve Montanans, and to be reminded of the respect for that. It's that this isn't just some casual opportunity here. It's not your seat. It's for serving the people of Montana, right?
And that's what he took seriously as well, because if you remember, besides being in the minority, he never represented the entire state of Montana. He represented the Eastern Congressional District, because when it went to one seat, he was pitted against Pat Williams. He lost that race. And so even though he only represented the Eastern Congressional District, we were required to pay attention to anybody that wrote in from Hamilton and Kalispell and Phillipsburg, because he took the job seriously, and he didn't really care whether you were out of his district or not. He cared most about all of Montana. Didn't get to represent it, but in his own little way, he did, because his interest in the timber industry, let's say, with natural resources, mattered a lot to him, or agriculture. It's not just in eastern Montana, it was in western Montana too. So he took his representation very seriously, and as a result, some people misread it as him stepping on other toes or involving himself in issues that weren't really supposed to be his, but he took that responsibility serious for the entire state of Montana.
Well, and it could be an interesting template, too, as Montana, depending on the census results and the apportionment committees, redistricting and all of that. But if Montana were to get a second congressional seat, could we have another East-West, two members of Congress? And so a lot of folks might be wise to look at how Ron Marlenee did things and ran things to yes, take care of your district and your piece of the state, but also we're also interconnected, and people in Scobie care about people in Hamilton. And so recognizing the importance of not just saying, nope, sorry, my district ends here.
Well, I hope we do get that second seat, because if you think about Montana, we have the second largest geography of any congressional district, but by far the most population of any congressional district in the country, at about 1.2. And there are some districts that are a little over 500,000. The average is supposed to be 750,000, and we had 1.2. And the distance of our congressional district is Washington, D.C. to Chicago. So it's very difficult for one person to represent all 56 counties all the time on all the issues. You're one, or you have two senators, and so it would really behoove us to have more babies or something. Encourage people to fill out their census and be Montana citizens, because we'd really like to make that threshold where we get a second congressional district.
Congressman Rehberg, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for sticking around. Yeah,
you bet.
Where do you want to start? As the small business guy, as the guy who served in Congress? What's your take on everything?
Here we are. I left Congress to open up a number of restaurants. Boy, how did that work out for me with the coronavirus? So if anybody's interested in some restaurants, we're on the market right now.
Ooh. Yeah, being a business owner sounds great, right? But it's a lot of work. Yeah.
It is a lot of work, and especially in this kind of a situation. And Ron represented the Safari Club because he loved hunting so much, and I'm a lucky guy. I get to represent babies. Anything 0 to 3, infants and toddlers, I get to represent them in Washington, and I also represent the Gallaudet, which is the school for the deaf and blind.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm human service oriented as far as my practice in Washington, babies and the deaf, and I love it to death. But the coronavirus is interesting. I keep getting asked the question, should they be able to vote remotely and all that kind of stuff. And while we have social distancing, I'm going to give you a term that I haven't heard yet, and that is political distancing. What we have going on in this country is the division between the parties that's getting worse and worse every year. When I was elected in 2000, we could actually do things with Democrats, not like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan together having cigars and whiskey, but actually working together. And I've got a lot of friends that come from the Democrat Party that we worked on natural resource issues and agricultural issues. And the difficulty is, over the years, it's become so political that they really have a political distance themselves. They've divvied in the corners, and it's making this whole coronavirus issue very difficult because there's two warring factions out there, and you've got one party representing one house and another party representing the other, and both of them want to win them back from each other, and then everybody wants to beat the president, and that doesn't create a very good environment for trying to solve the coronavirus issue.
And they can't even put aside their bickering and their partisanship in the middle of a crisis. I get it. Even on a day-to-day basis, it was frustrating, but in the middle of a crisis, I remember it seemed like Republican, Democrat senators were working together, and then Pelosi gets on an airplane, flies back to Washington, blows everything up, and then they've been in all their camps even since in the midst of this crisis.
Yeah, and I, of course, was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th and was involved in all of that. And but see, there we had an enemy, and we knew who the enemy was, and we could attack it. This is kind of a crisis that doesn't have an enemy, and nobody really recognizes, who do you blame? Do you blame the Chinese? Do you blame our inability to react quickly? And unfortunately, without the person to point at, the president probably gets or does get more blame than he should, and the Congress is not in town, and that's why the political distancing, I think, is a problem. We should never go to remote voting because it's already hard to get members together, especially when you have the kind of budget that allows you the opportunity to work 2 weeks and then go back to your home district for a week and then work 2 weeks. And Ron Marlenee never had that kind of a travel budget. He didn't have that kind of a staff. Back in the day, you had to stay in town. You just weren't flying back and forth, and you got to know your colleagues. You still stayed in touch with your constituency, but you got to know your colleagues well enough that you had friends on both sides of the aisle, and you could usually figure things out. And it's getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
Every day that goes by, it's getting harder to create those kinds of relationships between Republicans and Democrats.